A lot to get to here on a Thursday episode. We've got arbitration numbers. We've got stadium upgrades. We've got promotional calendars. We've got to look at who's on the 40-man bubble. It's all coming up and more. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, January 9th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to get to a grab bag of Orioles topics. We're going to talk about the latest updates on the stadium renovations, some good news surrounding video board and sound system coming to Oriole Park pretty soon. I'll give you my power rankings on my favorites of the promotional items the Orioles are giving out this season that they announced this week. We'll talk a bit about arbitration numbers as the deadline was on Thursday evening to exchange those figures. We'll talk about salaries for some Orioles in 2025. Wanted to take a look at the 40-man roster right now because it is full. If the Orioles make any more moves, they're going to have to DFA some guys, and now it might be some guys that might hurt a little bit. I'll talk about which guys are on that roster bubble for the Orioles. And then finally, at the end of the show, did want to do a little bit to celebrate the life of former Orioles left-hander Brian Matusz. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So we begin today's episode. This is really going to be hitting on a lot of topics here on a Thursday evening. Was going to actually have this be the Friday episode, but the Orioles love to do a Friday news dump. Last Friday, it was the Charlie Morton signing. I'm trying to leave the Fridays open to wait for the Friday news dump. So this will be a little Thursday evening episode here to potentially round out the week, or you'll hear from me again tomorrow when the Orioles make some more big news. But there's been a lot to catch up on in Birdland, and just kind of wanted to do the smorgasbord of all that good stuff here on this episode. And then, of course, at the end, wanted to leave some space to talk about the life, the career of Brian Matusz, who tragically passed away earlier this week. Of course, the former Orioles left-hander. But we're going to kick it off by starting and talking about some ballpark upgrades. And this is something we've known was coming since the Maryland Stadium Authority and the state government approved essentially a gigantic chunk of money going to the Orioles. About $600 million coming to the Orioles for stadium renovations. A lot went to the Ravens and M&T Bank Stadium as well. And they've gotten a little bit of a head start on their renovations. Now, some of that was because the Orioles were going through an ownership change, so that was delaying a bit what they were going to do to the ballpark. But it seems like the first things they're going to do are actually going to happen this offseason. Now, we do know the Orioles are in the process of moving the left field wall back in. That is being paid for by the Orioles. That is not coming out of the $600 million given to the O's by the state. But the first thing that's really going to happen, as Hayes Gardner wrote about and reported about in the Baltimore Banner on Wednesday, former guest of the podcast, Hayes Gardner, does great work now at the Banner. Make sure you go and check him out, is that the Public Works on Wednesday approved the Maryland Stadium Authority plan, where $135 million in ballpark renovations will begin. It is the first part of what is a bigger $400 million renovation project for Oriole Park at Camden Yards, despite it being one of the best ballparks in baseball. It is now over 30 years old, and it is in need of some upgrades. And the big ones, they are certainly doing first. Now, Gardner reporting, and the Orioles also announcing this as well, that the O's will upgrade the video board and sound system to be ready for opening day 2026. So not quite everything by 25, but by opening day 2026, going to be a brand new video board and a brand new sound system in the ballpark, which is desperately needed. The video board is okay. That is certainly not my biggest gripe with the park. It's nice that it's going to get upgraded. It's going to be better and maybe better angles and all that good stuff. But the real issue is the sound system. If you have been to an Orioles game at Oriole Park at Camden Yards in the past, I mean, I would say at least 5 years, it feels like this has been an issue at this point. If you've been to a game in the past 5 years, you know The sound system is a gigantic issue. There's parts of the ballpark where you can't hear anything. There's parts of the ballpark where everything is muffled. It's like there's only certain parts of the park where you can actually clearly hear at a regular volume what is coming over the PA system, whether it is the PA announcer, whether it is music, whether it is games being played, whatever it is. It's not good. And I think a lot of Orioles fans share the same sentiment. And I think the Orioles themselves know that as well. So the good part is they're actually going to do a temporary fix for the 2025 season. So the brand new system is not going to be in until 2026, but the Orioles are going to put in a temporary sound system that will be an upgrade just for the 2025 system, or season, I should say, and then the permanent system will be in for 2026. So when you get to your first Orioles game this season, be on the lookout, or I guess hearing more than looking, but hopefully those upgrades, even the temporary ones, will be a gigantic plus over what in the world was going on with that sound system over the past couple of years. We're going to start to hear more and more about it. Seems really into next offseason, what they're going to continue to use more of that $400 million to $600 million to do with this stadium. But this is definitely an exciting first step. This is beyond thoughts about how I feel of using taxpayer money to upgrade ballparks. Beyond that part of it, this is something the park desperately needed. There's a couple of kind of inner things, control rooms, cooling systems that are getting an upgrade in this first $135 million plan, which will be nice for everyone in the ballpark as well, especially those who work at the park. So all good things happening so far to this ballpark. And really the other big thing you'll notice in the ballpark, except for the left field wall being moved back in this offseason, which they have already gotten a ton of work done on, it seems. There's been a couple of pictures that have leaked out of what they've done so far, but the splash zone is expanding. The splash zone for the last couple of years has been maybe the most popular section in the ballpark. Section 86 out in left field, right by the bullpens, has been the splash zone. And Mr. Splash has been out there with his hose, spraying down fans in that section after big hits, runs scored, big plays, whatever it may be after Orioles wins. It feels a little bit better in the middle of the summer than it does in April or September, but still a cool thing that the Orioles have done. And that section, has pretty much been sold out for all 81 home games for the last year and a half. It has certainly been a good idea by the Orioles to go and put that out there, and now they are expanding it. It will expand over to Section 84. That is the neighboring section. If you go one section closer to the left field foul pole, will also now be considered the splash zone. And it's pretty smart by the Orioles, because it's not like you're expanding it to 5 sections and you're worried about not filling it. If you're filling 86, which is a pretty small and slim section for every game, you figure, well, if we add in 84, another full-size section, we shouldn't have issue filling that up as well. I'm sure Orioles marketing and ticket people saw the demand and said, hey, we could easily fill up another section of the splash zone. That's what the O's are going to do. So expect high demand for now section 86 and 84. And it looks like on the new renderings of the left field wall moving in, Mr. Splash's platform is going to kind of run all the way down from the one end of section 84 to the other end of 86 where the bullpens are. So a lot more hoses, a lot more splashing going to be going on out in left field. Actually, I have not sat in the splash zone yet. If it's not July or August, I'm not sure I want to, but maybe I'll try to check it out at some point in 2025. But speaking of Mr. Splash, Orioles video team did a fantastic job with their promotion video announcement, doing like a video game character type announcement video, and Mr. Splash was involved in that. And you can go to Orioles.com, go wherever, to check out all of the promotional giveaways that the Orioles will be doing at home games during the 2025 season. But I wanted to power rank my 5 favorites. Now, this might spark some big discussion, so let me know. Again, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Let me know here in the YouTube comments your top 5 favorite promotional giveaways the Orioles are doing in 2025. Number 5 has got to be the Oriole Bird Squishmallow. You rarely see them give out any kind of stuffed animal or plushie. That's a pretty good giveaway. It is for kids 14 and under, although I would figure a lot of adults are going to want that too, so that's going to be interesting to see that play out at the ballpark. Number 4 for me is the Orioles hockey jersey. Big fan of the hockey jersey. I think it looks pretty good. Number 3 is the Orioles bowling shirt. Kind of an interesting idea there from the O's. Number two is the Orioles cowboy hat. I'm not sure it was something I would wear, but it's kind of an outside the box thing. And then honestly, I got to tell you, I like the look of the Orioles straw hat. And I'm going to put that number one. Now, there were a lot of others that I considered here. The City Connect soccer jersey looks pretty good. I like the look of the Hawaiian shirt this year. The Pride Night uniforms that they're giving out look cool too. The Jim Palmer replica orange jersey that they're giving out. They got some Star Wars bobbleheads. I'm not a Star Wars fan at all, so I know a lot of people are psyched about the Colton Cowser, Gunnar Henderson Star Wars bobbleheads in May. Not my cup of tea, but that's okay. There's a Rubenstein bobblehead. There's an Adley Rutschman golfing bobblehead. Pretty good lineup of promotional materials that the Orioles are going to give out. But yeah, I like the hat selection this year. There's a beanie. There's a corduroy hat. There's a straw hat. There's a cowboy hat. There's a bucket hat. A lot of hat offerings by the O's, and I think they did a pretty good job with the promotional calendar. But again, let me know in the comments your top 5 promotional giveaways that the Orioles are doing in 2025. Now, speaking of the Orioles doing some giveaways, they gave away a little bit of money to some of their players here on Thursday, as it was arbitration time on Thursday. And coming up next, we're going to talk about some arbitration numbers. We're going to talk about this 40-man roster and where it sits now, and this is kind of some nitty-gritty roster stuff going on, but it is newsworthy as the Orioles' payroll definitely has gone up this offseason. Well, we'll get to that coming up after this. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you're paying for twice? Well, that definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for. And Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. And I think the best part for me is, like, some of these subscriptions, you find out you're still paying them, you want to cancel them, but you have to make a phone call to cancel them. I don't want to do that. Rocket Money does the dirty work for you. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That is rocketmoney.com/lockedon. One more time, rocketmoney.com/lockedon. So from the ballpark upgrades, we moved to the roster upgrades for the Orioles. And Thursday was not a super important roster financial deadline, but one that brings a lot of tweets from a lot of beat writers and gets some people confused. So I want to kind of clear up what was going on Thursday and what it means for the Orioles roster. Basically, Thursday at 8 p.m. was the deadline for teams and their arbitration eligible players to either agree to a salary number that player will make for the 2025 season, which is mostly based on their performance in 2024 and before that, or if the two sides, the team and the player, will file for arbitration. Now, arbitration is something we talked about back in November because that is when it kind of first comes up in the baseball calendar. You have arbitration eligible players. Generally, those are players who are in between their 4th and 6th years in the big leagues. You have 3 pre-arbitration years, 3 arbitration years, and then you hit free agency after you have been called up to the big leagues. And any of those players who are heading into that 4th year become arbitration eligible. So you stop making around the league minimum and you get a nice little bump up in your salary every year. But instead of having a set number, your salary is based on what your performance was last year and in general across your first 3, 4, or 5 years in the major leagues. Now, you can non-tender a player. That's something we talked about in the fall, where you say, hey, this player is probably going to be worth $2 or $3 million in arbitration. We don't even think this guy's going to be on our roster. Let's just non-tender him and we make him a free agent early. That is what the Orioles did with Jacob Webb. Jacob Webb was probably going to make about $2 million, but the Orioles were very concerned about his elbow, it would seem. Missed a good chunk of time with an elbow injury this year. When he came back, the stuff was diminished. He wasn't really the same pitcher. Now, he did end up signing a 1-year, about $1 million deal with the Rangers after the Orioles did non-tender him and make him a free agent. But they basically said, hey, we don't think it's happening for you next year. We're not going to pay you the money. We're just going to cut you loose and make you a free agent. And that is what the Orioles did. But everyone else who was arbitration eligible, again, between their 4th and 6th years in the big leagues, the Orioles tendered a contract to them back in November, which basically means, hey, we are going to bring you back on our roster for 2025, but we're going to basically kick down the road how much we're actually going to pay you. But Thursday, today, was the deadline for deciding on those numbers. So all that time between November and January, the team and the player's agent are negotiating, trying to figure out a fair number, salary-wise, for that player to make in 2025. They have until today to agree to a number. If they do, great. They settle on a salary. If they don't agree, they then have to go to arbitration, which the player puts in a number, or his agent says, this is how much I think I should be paid. The team submits a number. This is how much we think the player should be paid. And then they go to arbitration, where a neutral third party, basically a judge, hears the arguments from both sides and picks either the player submit a number or the team submit a number, and that is what the player makes in 2025. For the Orioles, they had a good chunk of players coming up in this category. They had 12 arbitration-eligible guys who were hitting this deadline here on Thursday for an agreement, and 11 of the 12 players came to a money agreement with the Orioles. Now, the first one was Emmanuel Rivera. He came to a $1 million agreement with the O's back in November, so the Orioles really didn't have to worry about Rivera anymore. And another guy in this list was Cionel Perez. He actually had an interesting thing in his contract where the Orioles had kind of already given him a team option for his number. It was a little convoluted, but he will be back as well. He's going to make about $2 million next year. But everybody else came down to the wire, as most teams do. You hear these things trickle in throughout the offseason, but mostly you don't get the number coming out until the day it's due, which was here on Thursday. And that is what has happened for most of these players. Now, these numbers, you see, Jake Rill of MLB.com and Andy Koska and Daniel Allentuck of The Banner and, Jacob Calvin-Meyer and Rock Kabako and all these people, different people tweeting out these numbers. Like the Orioles and so-and-so have agreed to a 1-year blah, blah, blah contract. The Orioles and Gregory Soto have agreed to a 1-year, $5.35 million contract. Andy Koska had that one at The Banner. That is not the O's signing a free agent. Gregory Soto is already on their team. He's already been tendered a contract. We already know he's playing for the Orioles this year. That is just them officially agreeing to exactly how much money he will make. It really is only a big deal for the player himself, so he can make more money, and for the team's payroll itself, because it can vary what exactly your payroll will be after these arbitration numbers. So I just wanted to run through them and also use MLB Trade Rumors, which does its arbitration projections every offseason, and they're usually very, very good, so just to compare them. So we'll start with Gregory Soto. As I mentioned, $5.35 million. The projection was $5.6 million, so maybe the Orioles saved a tiny bit of money there. Cedric Mullins will get $8.725 million in his final year before free agency. Trade Rumors projection was $8.7 million, so pretty much right on the nose there with that one. Ryan Mountcastle will get $6.787 million. He was projected for $6.6 million, so Ryan Mountcastle makes a little more money than was projected. Keegan Aiken agreeing to $1.475 million. His projection was $1.4 million, so pretty much on the nose with that one. Trevor Rogers will get $2.6 million next year. His projection was $2.8 million, so he gets a little bit less than maybe he thought he would. Ramon Arias gets $3.15 million. His projection was $3.1 million, pretty much on the nose. You can see how good the team over there at MLB Trade Rumors is at projecting these numbers. Tyler Wells, after a season where he missed most of it after Tommy John surgery, will get $2.075 million. His projection was $2.1 million. Dean Kramer was the one that was probably the biggest difference from the projection to the actual number. Dean Kramer will get $2.95 million for 2025. He was projected to get $3.5 million. So Kramer, and again, remember, the players are agreeing to these numbers. It's not just a number the team is throwing out there. The player and their agent are agreeing to the numbers, but Kramer may be getting a little less than most would have thought. Then you have Adley Rutschman, his first year of arbitration. He gets $5.5 million. His projection was $5.8 million. And again, these projections are done after the season, not before. So it's not like, oh, Adley went under the projection because it was so bad in the second half. No, it's just, $200,000 is a lot of money to someone like me, but to a Major League Baseball player, it's kind of splitting hairs in these conversations. And then Kyle Bradish, who again missed most of the season, will get $2.35 million next year. His projection was for $2.1 million. Now, the only player who was on that arbitration eligible list and did not come to an agreement with the Orioles, is Jorge Mateo. He was the only one. He is in his final year of arbitration. He will hit free agency after this season. He missed most of the final 2 months of the year after that wild elbow injury where he had to get surgery, and it's still kind of TBD if he'll be ready for opening day. It seems like the way Elias is talking, they're leaning towards they think he will be, but it's still in question. Jorge Mateo was projected for $3.2 million. Him and the Orioles did not come to an agreement, so he will be the only player that goes to arbitration. What that means is Mateo will submit how much he thinks he's worth. The Orioles will submit how much they think he's worth. Let's say maybe Mateo says $3.5 million and the Orioles say $3 million. They will go to a third party. The Orioles will argue why Mateo is worth 3. Mateo and his agent will argue why he's worth 3.5. The third party will not meet in the middle. The third party will only decide 3 or 3.5. Once they make that decision, that is what Mateo will make for 2025. Again, not the most important process because these players are already been tendered contracts, but it's kind of an interesting thing how it plays out. And it has backfired on players in the past because sometimes in these arbitration hearings, if it's a bigger name player who's not worth 3 million, maybe is worth 10, 11, 12 million, and it's a lower payroll team who's trying to save $500,000, $1 million here and there in arbitration to help with their payroll, teams have been known to, in front of their players and their agents, like break them down and say why they're not good and why they don't deserve that much money. And it can fracture some relationships. There was a little bit of that between the Brewers and Corbin Burns in arbitration before Milwaukee traded him to Baltimore. Hopefully that doesn't happen with Jorge Mateo. Probably won't with a guy with a lower projection at 3 million. But it is kind of a squirmish process in there sometimes in those arbitration hearings. Now, beyond that, I did want to talk a little bit about the Orioles 40-man roster as a whole, because the 40-man roster right now is full. Once the Orioles signed Charlie Morton, they actually had a full 40-man roster, had to DFA catcher Rene Pinto to keep it at 40 players. But if the O's make another addition this offseason, which again, it's a possibility they could go into spring training with this exact group and try to compete there, but I would have to think they're going to try to add another reliever, another starter. And yes, if they do trade for a starting pitcher, there's probably a good chance they trade one of their young starting pitchers in return. So those two would flip on the 40-man roster and open up a spot. But I also think there's a good chance the Orioles sign a relief pitcher before the offseason is over. When they do that, they're going to have to clear space on their 40-man. So I kind of wanted to look and see who's on that bubble right now. Like, who is most likely to be DFA'd next if the Orioles make a move? Like Rene Pinto getting DFA'd. He's been with the O's for a month. He was like the 4th catcher at this point. That doesn't really hurt the O's. But they're kind of at the point on the 40-man roster where everybody on it right now, the O's see some sort of path for them to help the Orioles in 2025. So that's why each of these decisions could hurt a little bit. So I'm going to go from number 5 to number 1. Number 1 being most likely left on this 40-man to get DFA'd next. I would say number 5 is Daz Cameron, right-handed hitting outfielder the O's brought in on waivers. He could absolutely compete for an opening day roster spot. He hits lefties, he can run, he plays the outfield, especially if Jorge Mateo is not ready for opening day. Daz Cameron could be that right-handed bench bat that fills in for him. But Cameron basically came over on waivers and could easily go out the same way. Number 4 on this list would be Blake Hunt. He is the catcher that the Orioles acquired in the Mike Baumann trade from the Mariners last year. With Rene Pinto out, Hunt is securely the Orioles' number 3 catcher behind Adley Rutschman and Gary Sanchez. He also has options, which is good. You can kind of send him up and down if you need him at any point. But he still hasn't debuted, and it's fairly easy to find a third catcher. So if the Orioles really had to do it, I wouldn't be surprised if they DFA'd Blake Hunt. Number 3 on my list would be Livan Soto. The Orioles acquired him 3 different times in 2024, and he did get a cup of coffee in the big leagues. And the O's like him. He has minor league options, which makes it nice. You can just kind of send him to AAA. But he was also DFA'd twice last year, which kind of shows he's a little bit expendable. And it's a very crowded Orioles infield. It's going to be hard for Soto to crack that case. He's more than likely going to begin the year and spend most of the season in AAA Norfolk. Now, the Orioles like him as depth with some upside, but if they have to DFA him, they shouldn't really bat an eye on that one. Number 2 most likely on my list is Emmanuel Rivera. I mentioned the Orioles did tender a contract to him and agree for $1 million, but that doesn't mean he's guaranteed a roster spot. Right now, when I projected the opening day roster last week, I didn't even have Kobe Mayo on it, and I definitely did not have Emmanuel Rivera making that roster as long as the Orioles are healthy. Now, I do think This is why, because I thought Rivera was just going to be non-tendered back in November. Like, hey, we brought you over when we were injured. You hit well, you helped us out, but kind of go on your way, because he had never really hit in his career before he came to Baltimore. And I thought they might non-tender him, but they didn't. And some of it was because, hey, it's $1 million. Might as well bring him back and see if he can continue to hit like that. But the other thing is, I think this is the reason why Rivera is still here. If the Orioles use Ryan Mountcastle, which is someone they've been offering up in trades, if they use him in a trade to get a starting pitcher, if they trade away Ryan Mountcastle, and then after that, they feel that Coby Mayo is not quite ready to kind of take over that first base role as the right-handed hitter and immediately slot into all those at-bats that Ryan Mountcastle was getting, Emmanuel Rivera, who not just plays third base, but also plays a good first base and is a righty who can hit left-handers, I think Rivera would get those at-bats for a month or two until they felt Coby Mayo was fully ready to take over. So that is why I feel Rivera is still on this roster. However, that's a lot of dominoes that have to fall for Rivera to get a spot. And he is also out of minor league options. So if he doesn't make the opening day roster, you can't just send him to AAA. You got to DFA him and put him on waivers, and somebody's probably going to pick him up at that point. So because of that, if you have to do it on opening day, if you don't see him making it anyway, the Orioles may just send him packing early if they need to. But that scenario with the Mayo and the Mountcastle is the reason why he's number 2 and not number 1 on the list. Number 1, who I think is the next guy to go, the next guy to get DFA'd. Say the Orioles sign a solid veteran middle reliever to a 1-year deal tomorrow, and they need to clear space on the 40-man. I think the move would be to DFA Brian Baker. I think that would be the next move. We know how big of a part of the Orioles bullpen he was in 2022. Then he had some struggles in 23. Then he got a few cracks at the big leagues in 24, but was mostly in AAA last season. He's definitely on a downward path with the Orioles right now. He still has really good stuff, but his command is just not there. His role has greatly diminished, and he now officially, for the first time, is out of options. So even last year when Baker wasn't a big part of the team, you could just send him to AAA easily. Now you cannot. Again, if Baker doesn't make the opening day roster, he also would be put on waivers. And again, his stuff is good enough where some rebuilding team would claim him and put him in their bullpen. Just like the Orioles did from the Blue Jays in 2021 to get Baker, some other team would absolutely do that. So if you know it's probably going to happen because you're just like, he's got so many guys to jump over in the bullpen power rankings right now, it makes it a lot easier to just pull that trigger now and make that DFA. I think Brian Baker would be my prediction. Now, I'd kind of talked about the options and the DFAs there. It's probably also good to know, like, who's entering this season with options and who's not, because that plays a big role in your roster status. If you have options remaining, that means you can be freely sent down to AAA, called back up to the big leagues with no roster implications. If you are out of options, you can't just be sent to AAA. You have to be exposed to waivers, and anyone can pick you up if you're not on the roster. So that really changes some of these opening day roster decisions. And it's something I'll talk about a lot in spring training when we start breaking down who could make that opening day roster. But I wanted to just break it down. Okay, hitters and then pitchers. Who has options? Who does not? Among the guys with, you know, the legitimate shots to make the opening day roster, these are the guys who are out of options. These are the guys who the O's are going to take an even closer look on because they know, hey, if they don't make the opening day roster, they go right on waivers and someone could pick them up and we lose them for nothing. Daz Cameron, Emmanuel Rivera, Ramon Arias, Jorge Mateo, Ryan O'Hearn, Cedric Mullins, Tyler O'Neill, and Gary Sanchez. So any of those guys, especially the earlier group, the O's will think twice a little bit if they're not going to make the opening day roster. And then the pitcher-wise, Zach Eflin, Tomoyuki Sugano, Charlie Morton, Seranthony Dominguez, Cionel Perez, Albert Suarez, all those guys are going to be on the opening day roster. However, then you start to worry a little bit if any of them struggle. And then finally, the last one on there is Brian Baker, which is going to make it maybe a little bit harder for him to stick with this Orioles team. So just a list to kind of remember as we get closer and closer to opening day. But those were kind of all the big Orioles news and notes and all the kind of little things I wanted to get to today. But still, obviously, want to talk about the just tragic news in Birdland from this week with the loss of Brian Matusz. I want to talk about his life and career and kind of what he meant to me as a young Orioles fan. That's coming up next to finish off the show. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Now, I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. One of my favorite moments of 2024, favorite memories, attending Orioles games. With tickets, I got at Game Time. Energy and excitement, unforgettable. Well, now Game Time has made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Recently, I was just peeking at tickets for Ravens Steelers, just taking a little pick on the Game Time app with Game Time Picks. I found amazing deals and could even see the view from my seat. Plus, the app has all-in pricing, total cost up front, no surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So I did want to just finish off today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast with just talking a little bit about the tragic news in Birdland this week. Former Orioles left-handed pitcher Brian Matusz tragically passed away at his home in Arizona on Monday. He was just 37 years old. The reporting we have at this point that it is a death investigation. The cause of death has still not been released at this point. We still don't know a lot about what happened, but we do know that this is just some of the saddest news you can get. I mean, a guy who, it's been 9 years since he was a Baltimore Oriole at this point, but a big part of the Orioles family, big part of Birdland when Matusz was here, and a big part of my childhood as an Orioles fan. I mean, he was on that 2012 Orioles team that brought me back into baseball, brought a lot of people back into baseball. But just want to talk a little bit about Brian Matusz. I know maybe some of the younger listeners, viewers of this show, maybe got into the Orioles recently, which we love. Whenever you find baseball is great, but you may not know Brian Matusz. He's a little deeper into the weeds, his career, a little unsung of a career with the Orioles, but he was billed, Brian Matusz, to be one of the next great things in Birdland. He was a first-round pick by the Orioles in 2008, fourth overall selection out of University of San Diego, and he was the player from San Diego. Since then, they've had Chris Bryant and others that have played there, but he was the guy. He was awesome in college. Came in with this great stuff. There was all this hype around him. He was part of that cavalry of pitchers, famously coming up for the O's, and it didn't take him long to debut. He didn't even pitch in the minors in 2008 after the draft. He pitched in the Arizona Fall League that year. Then 2009, he made 11 starts in High A Frederick, made 8 starts in Double A Bowie. And the O's said, I've seen enough. They said 19 minor league starts, I've seen enough. And they called him up to the majors in 2009 after just 8 starts in Double A. A year and change after he had been drafted. He comes to the big leagues. And he had some good starts early on. He did, though, struggle in his time as a starter from 2009 until 2012. Then the Orioles, though, made a key move for Matusz's career. They moved him to the bullpen in 2012. The O's were finally turning things around that season. He began the year as a starter, and he wasn't very good as a starter. So the O's set him down in July of 2012 and basically said, hey, we're going to move you to the pen, go to AAA, get your feet wet pitching out of the bullpen, and we're going to bring you back as a left-handed reliever. And they did that. They set him down in July, and he came back up in August as a reliever, and he was nails. 13 1/3 innings pitched in the regular season out of the bullpen when he came back up in August. 2 earned runs, 5 hits, 19 strikeouts to 3 walks. He was all of a sudden one of the best left-handed relievers in Major League Baseball for that last month and change of the season. And it was not only that, it was not like, hey, this is a good story, he helped us out. This Orioles team got to the postseason in 2012. For the first time in 15 years, they were the inaugural number 2 wild card in the American League. It was the first year, 2012, of the 5th playoff team in each league, and the first ever wild card game where the 2 wild card teams matched up in a 1-game playoff to continue on to the ALDS. And of course, the Orioles went to Texas to take on the Rangers, and it was a magical night. Orioles beat the Rangers 5-1, first playoff win since '97, moved on to the ALDS, and Brian Matusz pitched in that game, got honestly, the Orioles kind of scratched across their 5 runs. Like, it was a lot of small ball. It wasn't this giant hit late in the game. They just kind of scored and scored again and held the Rangers off with good pitching and won that game. But probably the biggest high leverage moment in that ball game, I feel like, involved Brian Matusz. He came into the game. O's were up 3-1 in the bottom of the 8th. There was a runner on second with 2 down, and Josh Hamilton, still at that point a masher of home runs in Major League Baseball, was at the plate representing the tying run, a guy who could hit the ball out of the ballpark anytime and could have changed that game in an instant. And the Orioles went to Matusz, who had been dominating left-handers since he went to the bullpen. Again, it had only been about a month and a half in the pen. And he came out there and just went fastball, 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 good morning, good afternoon, good night, struck him out on 3 pitches to get out of the jam to end the inning. O's would add 2 more in the top of the 9th. Jim Johnson, while he did load the bases, got out of it. O's won 5-1. They partied on the mound in Texas. They moved on. It was an amazing moment. And that 2012 team, and he did some other great things that we'll talk about in the next 3+ years out of the Oriole bullpen, but just him being part of that 2012 team. Of course, they lost in 5 games to the Yankees in the ALDS. And I remember at that point, with my age, that was the first good Orioles team I had ever seen. I was born in November of 1997, after the O's had been eliminated in the ALCS, meaning I had never seen not just a playoff Orioles team, I had not seen an Orioles team with a winning record until 2012. For the first 15 years of my life, I loved baseball, I loved the Orioles, and all they did was lose. And so that 2012 team, even though they got bounced in the ALDS, like more so than the 2014 team that won the division and got to the ALCS, more than the 2023 team that won 100 games and came out of nowhere. And I'm covering the team here. Great memories with that. The 2012, until the Orioles win a World Series, the 2012 Orioles, and I know there's a lot of you out there around my age that kind of feel the same way, and let me know in the comments here, but the 2012 Orioles are the team that I treasure most. Like, I have the most emotional reaction and memories to the 2012 Orioles. And Brian Matusz is a part of a lot of those, especially in the postseason. That strikeout of Josh Hamilton, he went on to pitch in all 6 games of the postseason that year. That's right. He pitched in the wild card game and then pitched in all 5 games of the ALDS. 6 appearances in 8 days in the postseason. And guess what? He was awesome. Now, he was your classic loogie, guy who comes in and basically just faces a lefty and comes out. But in those 6 appearances, 4 2/3 innings, 2 hits, 1 run, 6 Ks to 2 walks, he was great. Like, yeah, he gave up the walk-off homer to Raul Ibanez in Game 3 against the Yankees, but that was the only blemish he allowed in that postseason. He pitched in every single game. And I have so many vivid memories of Brian Matusz getting big outs against left-handers. And that Josh Hamilton one is just kind of seared into my mind in that, like, that was the first big game I had ever seen the Orioles win as a 15-year-old kid. And Brian Matusz got the highest leverage out probably in that game. And he just, he's a bad starter, moved to the bullpen and made one of the best hitters in the league at one time. Josh Hamilton just looked silly on 3 pitches. And, those are the memories you have as a baseball fan, a fan of a team, these more niche players who play smaller roles. But Brian Matusz played a big role for this Orioles team. I mean, after that, they stuck him in the bullpen and he was great for the next 3 years, 2013 to 15. He had a career 3.47 ERA out of the bullpen for the Orioles. He was, one of their go-to lefty relievers for 3 years, including, he was great on the 2014 team that went back to the postseason, and he pitched in the ALCS that year against the Royals as well. And it was a shorter career as an Oriole once he finally found his groove as a relief pitcher. And, he ended up he was on the team in 2016 out of the bullpen. That team went back to the playoffs, but Matusz had a rocky start. They ended up DFAing him in May. And the Cubs actually picked him up. He did start 1 game for the Cubs in June, and then they DFA'd him. That was his only major league game he pitched, not in Oriole uniform. 1 game for the Cubs, his final big league appearance. Pitched some in Indie Ball, pitched in AAA for other teams like the D-backs, pitched in Mexico through 2019. He won a championship with the Long Island Ducks, and then he was kind of done going into 2020. But just looking back on some of his stats, like this is an underappreciated reliever for his peak. And I think for Matusz, if he had even been 5 years younger, had come up, during a little bit more of the analytics revolution, if he had come up maybe under the Elias front office instead of the Duquette front office, like the things they could have been able to do with Brian Matusz, because he was throwing, fastball, slider, changeup, but his fastball from the left side was only 91, 92, and that's out of the bullpen, right? Like usually guys, when they go to the pen, maybe the fastball plays up more. Like, no, he was 91, 92, and yet he was a dominant reliever. Lefties hit just 200 off Brian Matusz as a relief pitcher. In his time as a reliever against lefties, 30% strikeout rate to a 6% walk rate with a 200 batting average. That is dominance against lefties. And thinking, how did he do it at 91, 92? Well, he was one of those pitchers where, back in 2012, 2013, teams knew about this stuff. Some teams did, but a lot of fans didn't. This is pre-StatCast, pre-Baseball Savant, all that stuff. He had insane ride on his fastball, on his four-seamer. That is that basically where it almost looks like the ball is rising because it just doesn't drop as much with gravity as other four-seamers, and it makes it so hard to hit. He had like elite top of the market ride. So even though he was throwing 91, 92, it had so much ride. It played like it was 97, 98, and like it was rising out of his hand. And if that could have been identified sooner while he was struggling as a starter, he could have made it as a starter for longer. He could have been a better reliever for longer if he had come up in just a little later era. But I think the thing that Orioles fans will remember about him most on the field, at least besides that great postseason in 2012, was he was the David Ortiz kryptonite. David Ortiz just could not hit this guy. And the amount of times they faced each other, Ortiz rolling through the AL East, Matusz in that bullpen for 4 years, back in the time when you didn't have the 3-batter minimum, so you could bring in a guy just to face one lefty and then take him out. Brian Matusz's job was to go get David Ortiz when he was at the height of his powers. And Ortiz in his career went 4 for 29 with 13 strikeouts against Brian Matusz. I mean, this guy dominated Big Papi. 6th most strikeouts for Ortiz against any pitcher. And Matusz is the only reliever in the top 10 of strikeouts against David Ortiz with 13. That's how good he was in a smaller sample size. And for Matusz, 13 strikeouts, that's the most strikeouts he had against any one hitter. Second place was, he also did well against Robinson Cano. He struck him out 8 times, but nothing like what he did to Big Papi. I mean, 138 batting average for Big Papi against Matusz was his lowest versus any pitcher with at least 25 plate appearances against him. Like, basically pound for pound, Brian Matusz owned David Ortiz more than any other pitcher in Major League Baseball. And that's a Hall of Famer in David Ortiz. Like, that is pretty cool to have on your resume. A guy like Brian Matusz, who otherwise had, not the greatest shining Major League Baseball career. And the other great stuff is, like, he was just known as such a great guy in that Orioles clubhouse. Teammates loved him. The outpouring of love and sadness and support from the Orioles family, people who played with him, coached with him, knew him from the baseball world over the past couple of days, has just been amazing and heartbreaking to see. And just to lose a guy like that at age 37, like, again, if things go differently and people kind of see how that fastball, maybe he's still pitching at age 37. Like, the Orioles just signed a 41-year-old Charlie Morton. Not out of the question that at 37, Brian Matusz could still be pitching in the big leagues. And thoughts go out, of course, to his family, his friends, the Birdland family, everyone who knew Brian Matusz well. Just definitely an important player for me. My childhood watching those 2012 Orioles, it was like Brian Matusz kind of encapsulated the 2012 Orioles. If you know the feeling of that team, which was, there were some stars. There were the Adam Joneses of the world on that team. There were the J.J. Hardys. There were the Matt Wieters and the Nick Markakises and the up-and-coming Chris Davises of the world. But that was a lot of parts put together by Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter that year. And it was just like, hey, you got to know what your job is and you got to do your job. And sometimes that job is going to change. You could be Chris Davis having to play right field because Nick Markakis breaks his hand. You could be Chris Davis having to pitch at Fenway Park because you're playing in a game that goes 16, 17 innings, whatever that game is. You could be Nate McLouth coming in June and being the leadoff hitter and the starting left fielder for a team when you were a free agent just trying to find some work. You could be Mark Reynolds, who has to be moved over to first base and play a position he hadn't played too much. You got to be Taylor Teagarden to come off the bench in the 18th inning and provide big hits as a backup catcher because apparently every swing you had in the world was just that clutch. You had to be Jim Johnson, knowing you were going to pitch in the 9th inning pretty much every single time you went out there, and you had to be these guys like Brian Matusz to be like, hey, we tried you as a starter again for the 4th straight year. It's just not working out. We're going to send you to AAA, and you got to be ready to change your role completely. It's not going to become with as much glory, a left-handed specialist versus a starting pitcher for a playoff team. but he accepted that role and he thrived in it. And I think that encapsulates everything that made the 2012 Orioles so special. Kind of comes down to Brian Matusz, and just so sad to lose him at age 37. Again, thoughts go out to his family, his friends, everyone who knew him well. Brian Matusz at age 37, always part of the Baltimore Orioles family. But if you watch Matusz, if you knew Matusz, leave in the comments here on the YouTube channel your favorite memories of Matusz on the field, off the field. He was a Roberto Clemente Award nominee for the Orioles at one point. Just like an awesome person. Was big in the Casey Cares Foundation. Went to local hospitals, worked with the kids so much. There was a funny Masson video on YouTube from like 15 years ago where he always wanted to be a firefighter. Apparently, Brian Matusz did. So he went out with the Baltimore City Fire Department, and they basically taught him how to like use the hose, use the truck, all that good stuff. He just seemed like a great guy. And again, if you have memories, share them with others in a tough time for Birdland as Brian Matusz passes away at age 37 earlier this week. But that'll do it for today's episode. Ran a little longer than usual, but had some thoughts about Brian Matusz, what he meant to me as an Orioles fan and what he meant to the Orioles overall. But that'll do it for this one. Unless we see some other breaking news, we'll be back on Monday with a new episode. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.